optimized for deciding and acting. You're representing a part of public defense, so make sure to speak for them as well as yourself. Everything that happens in this room is fully shareable, outside of it too, so make sure we're transparent. Each session is recorded, so feel free to turn your video off if you need to eat or anything else, so that's just fine. We're waiting for Scott Thompson to come in. He's having some problems coming in, but we'll loop back around with him on the previous motion. He had seconded the original motion, and so we wanted to make sure that that was okay with him when we added to it. We didn't change anything other than to just conform a little bit to the grammar we were using in the new addition to the motion, the original recommendation. In the meantime, we had a sorry about that. We had a discussion on investigator to attorney ratio. There was a bit of a consensus around a 1 to 3 ratio, and there was some further discussion about that. Brooke, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
I had written a draft motion on this at the end of our last meeting in preparation for this. If this is just to get discussion started, I'm not sure if I should dump it into chat or just say it. What's easiest, Billy?
Elaine is available already just to type that up. So you can go ahead and start speaking it. She'll pull the document up. She's also trying to admit Olcott Thompson right now too. So
yeah, if you can give me just 1 second, I'm trying to dial Olcott. Thank you.
Sure.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Elena. Well, we can move on just a little bit while we're waiting for that. Just give it a few more minutes. As soon as Elena comes back on, then we can accomplish that. One of the things to be thinking about as we sort of will potentially have this sort of final recommendation for investigation ratio, our next step is going to be to think about how we're going to present this to the commission. And part of that presentation is going to be sort of identifying for them any sort of budget impacts to what we're doing. And so we're working on that right now and anticipate we will have that document, that information out by next Friday, and then the following meeting, so we can really think that through. And again, the purpose is not for the budget to drive the policy, but just to inform the commission about the cost of the recommendation. And we do have a quorum now, so that's good. Jonathan Saar is not able to be here today, and Autumn has to leave at 12:30. So that's we should keep that in mind as well. Well, you know, this is pretty good for all of the meetings we've had. I think this is the first time we've had to delay a bit for some technical issues. So that's not too bad for the number of meetings we've had. I don't know if y'all have ever been in any meetings where it just didn't work right and then you had to wait. Maybe everybody's the exception to that. I don't know.
Nobody's a cat. So
Unlikely. Brooke, do you have Elena's email? You could potentially email her what you have, and then she could just copy and paste. That might work well too.
I sent it, Billy.
Thank you. I wonder, David, I wonder if we could pulled up on our end. Would you want to?
Yeah. As long as we don't.
I just got a pop-up that says Olcott Thompson is in the lobby and wants to know if I want to admit him. Should I try?
We've been trying. Yeah, it's not letting us admit.
I can try.
Sure, yeah,
It's
go for
asking
it.
me if
Go
I
for
want to, but
Go for it.
oh, it says he's gone now. It says Jack is waiting in the lobby.
Yeah. Just not wanting to.
Yeah, Olcott, yeah,
I think Elena is trying to accomplish that, having him calling.
maybe I can just email him.
She's on the phone with him.
Or maybe he can put on.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, yeah. Where is he? He's not exactly. Yeah. I was thinking that too for a second, then I'm like, no, wrong office.
Brooke, how about this? You have David Orton's email address. You could send it to him. David is the one that's kind of running it on our end here, and then he can just pull it up. That way we can kind of keep moving on that. Thank you.
Yep. Hi. Thank you.
Oh,
There's Scott.
Scott, we can hear you. Can you hear us? Uh-oh.
Right. Well, I think Elena might be free then if Olcott's in. We go back to Plan A.
Yeah, I will pull this up and thank you for sending that along. Just 1 second here.
We did hear Scott for a minute, but then, oh, there he is.
I'm here. Can you
All
hear
right.
me?
So Elena, before you pull that up, I wanted to just, Olcott, you were probably reading through the minutes and you saw that we had mentioned your name because we needed a second. You had seconded the original motion, and then we amended the recommendation. The original recommendation was only amended to really just conform with what we were adding in a second paragraph to that. And so just wanted to make sure that you were okay with that because you had seconded the original motion.
I am absolutely okay with it.
All right, thank you. Elena, we are ready. So this, Brooke, go ahead, Brooke, you want to explain this?
Sure. So at the end of our last meeting, as you mentioned, Billy, I think there was a general consensus that people who were talking that 1 to 3 was a pretty decent ratio. And I started writing this with the idea of saying public defenders and then private law firms. And I realized there's no reason to limit it like that. If any contractor employs private investigators, I think the point is to provide the same or similar staffing levels through OPDS. So the motion is basically for contractors who employ private investigators, OPDS shall fund investigators at a rate of 1 investigator for every 3 attorney FTE. And then I'm adding this next sentence just because I foresee problems if we don't, and I'm okay without the second sentence if people have issues, but all investigators funded in this manner must be licensed in accordance with ORS 703-430, and that's just the DPSST qualifications. And I'm not willing to die on that hill, but I just thought I'd throw it out there because it might make it more palatable from an agency perspective.
Any discussion on that? And is that a motion, Brooke?
Sure, I'll make it as a motion.
I got a question.
Yes.
Is this directed at, is this for attorneys? I mean, this is Chris, kind of, I've been eating lunch, so you can't see me, but we've got a consortium, limited number of investigators. So when it says that for contractors who employ private investigators, OPDS shall fund investigators at a rate of 1 investigator for every 3 FTEs. I'm just not sure what this is directed at. Is this directed at the attorneys, at the investigator? Or, I mean, what happens if you got is that so you're going to have a certain amount that an investigator is going to be paid? Because we just send in a request, and are we thinking of changing that, or I'm just not following what this is all about.
Brooke, you want to respond to that?
Sure. That's a good question, Chris. I had originally written this for public defender offices and private law firms who employ private investigators, but I put contractors because I thought that it's possible with a ratio of 1 to 3 that consortia overall might want to have shared investigators. I don't know if that's doable or not, and I'm happy to abandon it. I was just proposing it as a starting point because it just seemed like it gave us more options. But if that's problematic, I have no issue just restricting it. So the intention was any attorneys who, as part of their practice, employ private investigators as staff or shared staff, as opposed to the NRE practice of hiring at an hourly rate.
So again, I guess I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer most of the time, so I'll ask a couple more questions. But so is this directed at, say, I'm a 3-attorney firm and we have a consortium and there's 6 attorneys in my consortium. The other 3 are independent contractors. We all hire investigators. My firm hires pretty much one, sometimes another. The other ones hire different investigators. So I'm just not sure how this would apply to us. I'm just trying to wrap my head around that. I see where it would apply maybe to PD offices and that sort of thing, and maybe even just a private law firm that contracts with the state, I guess, if they want to have an in-house PI. But I think most of us, or at least a lot of providers, sole practitioners and that sort of thing, just go through the NRE process. And so are we anticipating that changing for the sole practitioner, or I just trying to figure this out?
Chris, I would say that the word employ drives that. It would be an employee, so that would not apply in your situation because you don't have an employee investigator. You're subcontracting out for that work and or just hiring it.
Then I think that should say for contractors who hire a private investigator as an employee, OPDS shall fund. I mean, that to me, because employ, when I hire somebody, I guess we can cut hairs on employ, but I just think that's not as clear as probably it should be, at least in my humble opinion.
Do you have a suggestion?
I think for contractors who employ private staff, private investigators on staff, would that work?
I think that would work. I think that's better.
And then, Todd, you had your hand up first, and then Jack, and then Mark.
I played with this too after I read the minutes and everything. And part of this, I think, is we need to, I'm not pointing fingers at anybody, but at PD's offices and people who are not having staff investigators who should, PD's offices and law firms essentially, that they should have staff on. And so my thought was using the same language as before, but OPDS shall fund and the contractors shall hire investigators at a rate of 0.3, well, 1 investigator for every 3 attorney FTE. I mean, I think part of this is we want not just OPDS to fund them, fund the ones that are already there, but to have offices that are not using investigators to use them, to hire and use them. It's every 3. And then my second part of it was, and this goes to consortia, because I don't think consortia work otherwise, is for all other entities directly contracting with PDSC, the contract administrator shall encourage and promote the use of investigators. The contract administrators shall encourage and promote the use of investigators. think consortia attorneys have problems because they don't use investigators like they should. But I also think that from our discussions and the information we have is that offices that are the offices that are directly contracting with OPDS don't have investigators when they should, and certainly not the ratio.
Brooke, any thought on that sort of friendly amendment?
I don't have issues with it, although it seems to restate some of the same concepts and add concepts. So I've got no issue with it conceptually. I'm just kind of chewing on the language.
Jack, you had a comment, your hand up?
I do. So in all the time that I've been doing this, if somebody were to ask me what's the most difficult part of your job, the answer that I honestly have given in the past is trying to hire investigators. It is virtually, my experience has been it's virtually impossible. What we're contemplating here would make it absolutely impossible. If this is a mandate to the contractors that they shall have three investigators to staff, the difficulty that I have finding a single investigator, I can't imagine trying to have three. So there's a problem there. There's also a problem with, I do have investigators on staff, but I still want to keep the ability to hire outside investigators, because you have cases occasionally where you want a particular type. For lack of a better example, what comes to mind is a sex case where you want, if you can find one, which again is almost impossible, you want a female investigator, and all you've got on your staff are male investigators. So I think the ratio, while it's admirable, is really problematic. If you're excluding being able to use investigators outside your office, that's problematic. And the licensing requirement, it's just impossible. It's just not, it may work great for a large contractor in the Valley. That's fine, although I think it's going to cause some problems. But for small contractors in the rest of the state, this is just absolutely impossible in my view.
Thank you, Jack. Mark?
How I kind of understand what we're trying to do here is to set basically a basement level of number of investigators that would be available per number of attorneys. I think that's fine. And I think the goal would be is to have more investigators. Personally, I think it probably could be a 1-to-1 ratio. If you really want really quality work to be done, is have one investigator per attorney. But I think at least from a consortium standpoint, I think it would be kind of a good idea to have at least some idea that recruitment is necessary in the more rural areas to have an investigator available, and so that it's. I understand. I guess from my point of view, I think we should probably have a minimum level of what OPDS would try to encourage, at least in the community. And maybe it's not good to reflect it as per attorney, but maybe it'd be reflected more as to the number of cases that are filed, and have that be more the driver than the number of attorneys equivalent standard. So I don't know. I that may be a better way to do it, is to have it, because at present the OPDS is setting 300 misdemeanors per year as a full-time equivalent. Maybe it would be a good idea to, instead of doing it this way as it's being related to the number of attorneys, which seems kind of arbitrary to me. Maybe it would be better to say, you know, per 100 cases, there should be at least one investigator or something. At least that's kind of what I'm thinking, so available.
Thank you, Mark. I know there's a number of people calling in on the phone right now, and so I want to make, and I'm not able to see, and you're not able to indicate that your hand is raised. So if there's anyone else that has a comment, go ahead and just chime in, and we'll manage it as best as possible.
This is Michelle Bartov. I had a question, I guess, about the last sentence, which is for other entities directly contracting with PDSC, the contract administrator shall encourage and promote the use of investigators. I'm a little bit concerned about that language in a couple different ways. So one, how are we going to keep track of that? How are we going to monitor those levels? Is OPDS going to gather that information and distribute that to contract administrators? And then how much time is that going to eat up for OPDS and for contract administrators? How would we necessarily encourage and promote that? That's just, that language is a bit fuzzy to me. And then there's also the issue of, if we're going to be having contract administrators doing that additional work, is there going to be additional funding coming to cover that additional work that's not being done right now? That's always a concern. So I'm not a huge fan of this language. I share the concerns of that Mark raised. I'm just not sure how this would work for consortias. I think I shy away from that like shall mandate in this respect. I'm just not sure how it will work for consortia, and those are my concerns. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. I have Autumn. I don't know. Haven't seen Bruce yet, but Autumn, Bruce, John, Rebecca, and Todd. If you have an opportunity to speak.
This is Rebecca. I guess what I would say is that my contract does exclusively juvenile work, and I don't think we use investigators as much as we would use, say, social workers. I have somebody on staff full-time who goes out and writes reports for me regarding home visits for some of my child clients, who I also visit myself, but having her detailed reports where she talks to the foster parents is really helpful. And so I know that we have differentiated between investigator versus, social worker and stuff like that. But what I can say is that, so I have 3 full-time juvenile lawyer, 3.5 full-time juvenile lawyers on my contract within my own law firm. So by this definition, I would need to, in addition to that, home visit specialist or social worker, and we also have a case manager that OPDS will provide funding for to help work with the parents. And so in addition to those people, I would need to hire an investigator. And I'm just not sure. There are some cases where I need to hire an investigator, absolutely, but I'm just not sure that this works as well for juvenile. And so we're not limiting this to criminal, we're talking about everybody. And I just don't know that even with the 3 full caseloads when I'm doing juvenile work in my own firm, that we could keep an investigator employed full-time and working on stuff full-time. I just don't see that. So maybe we need to amend this to talk more about criminal cases, which I think definitely you could use investigators more on. I'm not saying we don't use them at all. I'm just saying that this seems excessive for juvenile practice. And maybe we're not doing it right. Maybe because we haven't had an investigator on full-time, we're not doing it right, but it just seems excessive to me for our needs in juvenile land.
Thank you, Rebecca. Anyone else on the phone?
I can weigh in. This is Autumn. I wanted to go back to the call of the question. I thought that the call was to create a ratio for entities that already employ investigators on staff, and that's what this committee was supposed to do. I understand that we've already done things more than what we were asked to do, which is fine. I just, so far as there's concerns for the consortia, I would say maybe narrow it back to what Brooke's original idea was to just make this specific to entities that have investigators already included in their contract. But I take Rebecca's point as well. So, you know, I think that's a good thing to consider as well.
Thank you, Autumn. I should note too that in the relevant research, the U.S. Department of Justice Office of Justice Programs, Bureau of Justice Assistance, wow, that's a mouthful. They break it down by felony, misdemeanor, and juvenile. And for juvenile, the recommendation is 1 to 6. So 1 investigator for 6 attorneys. I don't know if the juvenile is juvenile delinquency only or if it's delinquency and dependency.
Todd here on the juvenile. It's we use them quite a bit in juvenile delinquency, so that's where they're the most common. We do at times use them in dependency. That's less common, and it's typically when a case is going to TPR or you have an unusual fact pattern initially when the petition is filed. So sometimes we do, but those are fewer than where in the delinquency it's quite often. When I was looking at the language, I thought we were somewhat looking at it for the contractors that do employ private investigators. I hadn't been looking at it from the perspective of contractors having to go out and hire investigators if they were at a certain size. So that's why Brooke's original motion for contractors to employ private investigators on staff. And then I thought that we were kind of looking at it as a minimum funding requirement. So fund at a rate of 1 to 3, 1 for every 3 FTE, where from the discussion that we heard last time, I heard some people saying that it's about they could use 1 investigator for every 2 FTE. So how some people might have contracts that do more above that. I was looking at this more as a minimum standard. And I do agree with Brooke that I think having the language in there that all investigators shall be licensed. I thought that was a requirement per our contracts. Correct me if I'm wrong, if it's not that way throughout the entire state. So that's the perspective I was looking at this from. Thank you.
Thank you. And is that Todd? Is that
Yeah.
you? That's okay. Great. Just wanted to clarify. John Hamilton or Bruce, if you're available. We haven't heard from you yet. Olcott, you had your hand up, and then I see Brooke and Jack have their hand up too.
A couple things that relate to the sort of the second paragraph. The second sentence should be for all other entities, because and I didn't do this well, the preamble to the first sentence should be for PD offices and law firms directly contracting with PDSC with at least 3 attorneys. And that mirrors the thing about staff supervisors. And that's sort of an alternative to Brooks. My impression was that in part of this was we did want PD offices and law firms to have investigators. And then as far as consortia, being a contract administrator, encouraging, promoting the use of investigators is me just keep reminding people that you ought to be using investigators. And when they come to me with questions about a case, which people do, get an investigator to go look at that or something else. So I don't think it's going to take much time, but ultimately all this that we're talking about, all the stuff we have talked about takes time and effort, and ultimately there's a fairly large budget, or at least a decent budget impact on from all of them. So.
Thank you, Scott. Brooke,
Yep.
Then Chris.
I think with the clarifications Scott makes, I think his motion actually makes better sense than mine. I have a few suggested revisions, but Basically, I think the first sentence of my motion is not needed if we go with COTS. The second sentence I think should go at the end as sort of a contractual issue if people don't have problems with it. So like, if you want to copy paste that down at the end, yeah, and then delete the first sentence in its entirety. So I heard what people were saying and some various feedback. I do think it's really important to tie this to attorney FTE, and I think it's a mistake to tie it to caseloads because we're really trying to stabilize FTE into sort of a workable caseload and workload standard. So I'd still really want it to be FTE. The one other sentence I was wondering if we wanted to have in here is occasionally even contractors that have investigators do hire outside investigators on an NRE, like our office does so on complex murder cases sometimes. So maybe a sentence in here before the last sentence, this does not preclude contractors from still applying for NRE requests for specific investigations, but OPDS may consider whether a contractor employs investigators and how many investigators are on staff. Do you want me to repeat that?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Brooke, repeat it.
Okay. This does not preclude contractors from still applying for NRE requests, NRE requests for specific investigations, comma. But OPDS may consider whether the contractor employs investigators and how many are on staff.
Yeah. That narrows like the people that all of a sudden lose an investigator at like PDSLC did. Where
Staff. Yeah, and then not the after employs investigators, not the investigators. Well, no, that is necessary. 2 words. There you go. That needs to be taken out. There you go. And one other thing, I did really intend this to apply to adult criminal because I think the ratio really is different for juvenile, and I think generally we've been talking about best practices for criminal. So the one other amendment I would suggest for the first sentence of Cott's motion here is every 3 adult criminal attorney FTE. So the third line, every 3 adult criminal attorney FTE. And I share Jack's concerns about whether there should be a mandate to hire or this is simply OPDS funds if you're able to hire. Because I could see a situation where a contractor is unable to hire and as a result they're doing NRE requests until they're able to hire someone. And so I'm not sure if I'm necessarily in favor of the contractor shall hire language in the second sentence, but I'm open to whatever the group thinks. I'm fine either way. I don't have a problem hiring the Valley, but Jack may be very correct that it's harder to, I mean, I'm sure Jack knows it's harder to hire outside of the Valley. So I'm okay on that either way.
Chris, you have your hand up. Thank you, Brooke.
Yeah, I think so. I understand, you know, I see where Jack's concerns are, and I think things are a lot different in the rural areas than they are in the Valley. As this is written, I mean, I'm a 3-person law firm, but we're in a consortium that I administer, and our firm is part of that consortium. And so we contract as a consortium with the state. So I guess technically this would not apply to me, but splitting hairs a little bit, if you have a firm, and I don't know Jack's situation specifically, or any other law firms that have 3 people. For example, if I just broke off and did a contract, there'd be 3 of us, so I would fall under this. And so my concern would be, 1, mandating this in these small firms where it's hard to find investigators, but 2, I'm not sure when we say hire, we've always done the NER process. I can tell you most of the investigators in our area that are willing to come here, I don't think would want to become, you know, I mean, we've used the term hire employees So I'm not exactly sure what we mean by that. Are we talking the firm hire somebody, so that would become an employee of the state? Do they independently contract with the state? Just, and then be designated to that law firm? Because I can tell you, we would lose a lot of investigators, the few we have, if you said, well, you got to become my employee. I think they'd find a different occupation or a different place to do investigative work. Even though they sometimes hate the NER process because they don't get paid timely, that's a different issue. They, asking somebody to become an employee is a lot different than having them as an independent contractor that you hire through the NER process.
Thank you, Chris. Jack, you had your hand up next, and then Brooke.
So just so there's no misconceptions, I want to say that I firmly believe that attorneys don't do enough investigation and don't use enough investigators. And particularly young attorneys who are reluctant to use any staff at all. So that's my position. Having said that, and putting aside any adjustments for a portion of your caseload being juvenile for the moment, I have a 9-attorney firm. This would require me to go out and find 3 licensed investigators. That can't be done. I'm sorry. It's just, that's not going to happen up here in the gorge. Now, maybe every place else in the state is different, but I can guarantee you that I will fail at that task, as no matter how hard I try. So it's just, I just don't see this as being workable, at least in my situation. If you want to write this up the way it is and say, except for Jack Morris's firm, well, but I want something that's workable.
What about instead of at least up to? I mean, that allows.
I can't hear what she's saying.
I'm sorry, Jack. I'm saying, instead of saying at least 3, attorneys to 1 investigator, what about up to 1 investigator? I mean,
Well, we could also change it to pull out the contractor shall hire. You can just say OPDS shall fund investigators at a rate of 1. I mean, that would be another way to solve that too. That would leave it up to then. So then there could be any iteration of that up to 1 investigator for every 3 attorneys. So, but that's not my motion. So.
Well, and I'm just going to suggest along those same lines, if you just switch the wording, so you say shall fund investigators hired by contractors. Then you take the shall hire out of there.
A great point too.
That way we're still talking about employees of contractors.
Brooke, do you have any thoughts on that?
Sorry, I was just trying to juggle lunch and the meeting. I think that is a good change because I think it reflects that when a contractor hires the investigator, OPDS has the funds to do it at a 3-to-1 ratio, but doesn't penalize contractors who are doing the NRE setup in the meantime because they can't get the staffing levels or whatever.
Right.
So I think that's a good change. So shall fund investigators hired by contractors at a rate of, right?
Mm-hmm.
By contractors, and then delete that second word investigators. Yeah, I think that works fine. The one other thing I would comment on I don't remember who just said this a few minutes ago about investigators not. I think Bruce, you mentioned this. That investigators would want to do their own thing, I think is what you were kind of implying. I know both in Eugene and Marion County, we allow our investigators to do side projects if it doesn't conflict beyond their 40 hours a week as staff for our office. And it has not ever produced any problems. And the few times it's an issue, they bring it to our attention, then we deal with it. But that allows me to still attract really talented investigators who might just want to do 1 or 2 side projects or work for an innocence project client or something. So I don't think having a staff investigator means that we are restricting them from doing us work. It's not like attorneys where OPDS has this concern that the attorney is going to take on too many cases. For investigators, I mean, they're licensed, they have an independent obligation under DPSST for what they're doing. So I don't have concerns about that. I just thought I'd mention that.
Thank you, Brooke. Todd, you had your hand up next, and then Chris, and then Jack.
My only concern, and it's with the last sentence, is I've done it before. I'm sure most folks are certainly with dealing with big cases have funded investigators who are not licensed in Oregon because they're doing investigation work for you in Arizona or New Mexico or Colorado or somewhere else. And I'm not sure how we deal with that with the language, but certainly, I mean, I don't care if somebody that's doing some work for me in Colorado is licensed in Oregon, and probably they aren't, but I want to be able to use them, and it's just, maybe it's all staff investigators funded in this manner. I'm not sure.
Kai, do you still have that concern if that sentence is moved to the second sentence and then it clearly only modifies what OPDS is doing for staffing funding?
That's a good idea. Again, it's my concern. You got my concern, and I wasn't sure how to fix it, and that one should do it.
Yeah, so just moving that to the second sentence is fine with me. No, second sentence, right after the word FTE in the third line. Yeah.
Yeah. And then maybe start another, if you will, paragraph, make it even clearer. Yeah, that solves it, Brooke.
All right, thank you, Pat. Jack, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to add the way I'm set up now with 9 attorneys, I've got basically an investigator and a half. The full-time investigator is in-house, so she's not licensed. I would lose her. The part-time investigator that we use for more serious cases is has an independent investigation business. I would lose him. This just is, I'm sorry, but it's just totally unworkable for my firm. And I suspect there's a number of other contractors that would be in the same boat.
I had a clarifying question, and I just don't know the answer to this. How hard is it to get licensed? Like, what's the license requirements, and why would an investigator not want to be licensed? It seems like it would make them more marketable. Could you understand me?
Jack, did you hear the?
If you're asking me, I would hope that if I have an in-house investigator, they're not worried about wanting to be marketable, because I don't need people coming in and staying for a short time and leaving. As far as the requirements, I don't know how hard it is. I wouldn't think it's terribly hard. I would just say that the investigators licensing board, there's an exclusion for people who work for one employer. I don't know why we would expand that.
I can just add from Autumn, from the MPD perspective, all 3 of our primary investigators were not licensed throughout the history of our firm, and recently they are all becoming licensed. They're getting letters from attorneys. I think they had to go through some testing. I'm not sure of all the requirements, but it's happening in our office, so just throwing that out there.
So would the attorney actually be licensed in accordance with the statute if they were only employed by one, like in Jack's situation where they're solely employed by that entity?
You mean investigator.
Right, and sorry, I'm an investigator. We had Brooke, and then Scott. Go ahead, Brooke.
So there's case law, but the case law has to do with whether an investigator can be disciplined by the board, and it goes into some different things. But the answer that we came to when I tried to solve this question for 2 different public defender offices was, yes, the investigator would have liability not being licensed, because so many of the projects we do are directed by the client asking for the investigation to be done. In other words, we may be one firm, but the fact that each attorney has 90 clients or whatever means that each project is being directed by what the client needs in that case. And we thought it was far safer to have investigation be licensed to comport with that. It is not a difficult process for someone who already has investigative experience to be licensed. The biggest issue is the practical number of hours required. And so the burden would be on someone who is not an investigator jumping on board doing it. I'm fairly confident that the person in Jack's firm could do it without a lot of difficulty. The burden would be on hiring a brand new person, like, I don't know, maybe like a former reporter or something who you want to be an investigator. And it would take some time, and you basically have to work on under another investigator's license in the meantime. So that is the hassle there. I'm okay not having that requirement for now if it's a breaking point. I just kind of assumed that OPDS wanted it anyway, but I don't care if we want to remove it. I think it's better practice to have it, but it's not a deal breaker for me.
Thank you, Brooke. Aaron, you have clarification?
I just want to also note, I've heard from CDSF, which is now merging with OJRC, that one barrier for some of the people that they employ as investigators is a criminal history background in terms of getting licensed. So from an equity perspective, there may be reasons for being flexible on that requirement. But I have not investigated that, and so I don't know the ins and outs of it.
Todd, you had your hand up next, and then Jack.
Unmute myself. Just one probable edit. I think the last sentence, this does not preclude contractors, belongs in the previous paragraph as it relates to people who are employing or hiring, directly funding contractors, investigators.
I agree.
Jack? Thank you, Scott.
Just anecdotally, I'll offer this and then I'll shut up. But I started my career at a large public defender's office that will go unnamed in Portland, Oregon. And the felony attorneys, there was two attorneys shared one investigator. And the attorneys all were extremely underpaid, had caseloads that were way too large. And the investigators, not all of them, but some of them spent a lot of time sitting around with nothing to do. So there's practical consequences to what we're doing. And like I said, in spite of the comments I've made, I'm all for attorneys using more investigators and more investigation, but I think we're tying a lot of people's hands with this.
Scott, thank you, Jack. Scott, your hand is up.
Sorry, I forgot to lower it.
Is there anyone else that has any comments? So do we have we sort of have a motion, but we do have a motion, but it hasn't been seconded. Scott, you have your hand back up?
Yes, back up, and I will second it as it's now been rewritten and on the screen.
Okay. Any further discussion?
I just have one clarifying. We put the statutory requirement is still in there, and I'm wondering if it belongs after FTE in the second sentence, just to clarify that we aren't attaching that to the NRE process. I don't know if it's required for NREs. So I think I would still, Elena, I'd move the last sentence in between those, or however you want to do it. Yeah. That was my understanding of the group's intent.
Brooke, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I agree, that's fine. But I think from our discussion, particularly Jack's concerns, but also the equity angle, because we do use CDSS and they are excellent, I would just take out that sentence. I think it's problematic, and y'all can fix that later as a contractual rule if you feel like it.
Todd, do you still second that?
I do.
Okay. Any further discussion? All right, let's take it to a vote. Autumn may already be off. Autumn, are you still on? All right, Brooke?
Aye.
Jack?
I'm sorry, is it too late to ask a question? Probably is.
We'll let you ask a question.
So this is limited to OPDS funding investigators. It puts no burden on the law firm or whatever to hire at a rate of 3 to 1. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes.
All right. Under those circumstances, I'll say aye.
And Chris?
Who'd you ask?
Chris, you?
Okay, I thought so. I just couldn't. Aye.
Mark?
Aye.
Michelle?
Aye.
Rebecca?
Aye.
Todd?
Aye.
And Pat, are you? Oh, yep, you're back on. Pat?
Aye.
And then Autumn, did I see you're back on? No. Did I miss anyone? All right. Thank you very much. So it is 12:42. We have a little bit of time. We can talk about presentation to the commission, how that might work. But I also think we have to, part of informing that conversation is going to be having more information about the budget impact of each of some of these. And we're working on that right now and should have that information out next Friday along with the minutes and whatnot. Any thoughts about presentation sort of before we get to that, without that budget information? This would be for the September 23rd commission meeting for now. I just found out that was scheduled, so, and I'm making a bit of an assumption that we're going to be on that agenda.
Do you have any idea whether we're going to be in person or remote?
Yeah, no, we don't.
I would say remote more.
Yeah, I would say remote would be highly likely.
I think it would be a much better presentation if we all all showed up and presented together, but beyond that, my comments are we get 3 or 4 people to tell the commission what we did and why we did it. And yeah, there's a budget impact and we recognize that.
Yeah. Yeah, we were kind of talking internally too, that whatever sort of iteration of, assuming it would be more than one person presenting, the impact would be greater if we could actually be there in person and sitting at a table. And then even those that maybe weren't presenting, but were part of the work group might be in the room and, that kind of thing. But we're just doing what we can, doing the best we can. Brooke, you have a comment?
Yeah, I agree. It'll be much better in person. I don't really know if that's realistic the way Delta's going right now. So I guess we probably have to assume it's virtual. And if it's in person, so much the better. It seems like there's a considerable amount of strength of having these recommendations, which are really quite a bit higher standards than we've had to use in the past, coming from OPDS staff with members of this group being available to then answer questions for the commission. Like, Billy, I think you would outline it pretty well, quite frankly. And so like having you sort of be the spokesman for what it is, spokesperson for what we talked about, but then having people in the group available, because I'm pretty sure the commission will have extended questions about this, because it does represent a pretty large change in a number of areas. And I realize there will be a fiscal impact.
I think it could be powerful also to identify someone up there as well from the work group, even just to be the spokesperson for the members. We can certainly identify somebody to be a spokesperson for OPDS, and I think that I completely agree. I think there's a lot of value in that too, but I think to actually identify someone for the work group would be beneficial, effective.
I think if we get enough people, we could have one person per, if you will, recommendation.
What I was thinking. That's exactly what I was thinking. I was just thinking that same thing, Alcott. It would be really good to have one person from the work group, break it up, and for each recommendation, that way it's not so onerous on one person to know it all. And each person can go back and review the minutes from the meetings and kind of outline what exactly happened, what the discussion was.
And I'll just add, I feel like the commission hears from staff a lot, and I think it's really nice when there's an opportunity to hear from providers directly.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
multiple voices are much easier to listen to than just one.
Yeah, yeah.
Any of us droning on for 15 minutes, we've lost them. But if you break up into 5 people, they don't get lost as fast.
Yeah, and then OPDS can tee up the process part of it, right? How we set it up and what we did and, just that kind of stuff. And then really have the work group members talk about the actual recommendations, I think could be really powerful. Well, do we want to take some time? Again, we know we're gonna have to meet next week to talk about some of the budget impacts. And let's take some time between now and then to really think about who might best represent each of the recommendations. If there were someone, like the investigator one is probably a good example, since it deals primarily with someone that employs investigators, we would probably want a work group member that employs investigators to talk about it. So, thinking along those lines a little bit, what might make sense. And then I think we're on track for the timing, for sure. So really the only bit of homework is on our end to sort of develop the budget impact, and then to identify some work group members that for each recommendation. I'll send the recommendations out too. I'll have that lined out in a document with the budget impact. So next Friday. Anything else for the good of the order? Otherwise, we can probably adjourn for now.
You're talking about next week, but you really mean in 2 weeks, right, Billy?
Next week, Friday, I'll send the information out. But then, yeah, the following Wednesday will be the final meeting. Yes, thank you.
You were talking about a meeting next week and just wanted to double check.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it. Appreciate it. All right. Well, thank you for your time. Good work. Brooke, you have your hand.
Billy, would it be possible during the commission meeting in August to just have staff give like a 30-second to 1-minute overview of what they're going to hear at the September meeting to prepare the commission for it? It seems like this is enough of a change that it might be useful. I don't know if it's too late to do that on the agenda or not.
Brooke, the status of the August meeting is just a bit up in the air for a variety of reasons. So if we can preview it, I think that's a great idea, and we should. So given the opportunity, we will do that.
Yep.
Cool. I make a motion to adjourn if there hasn't already been one.
Second.
All in favor? All right. See ya. Thank you.
Thank you.